Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. The episode you're about to listen to is a debate between myself and Tom Prosser, who has been on the podcast before, a few years back, on the question of is the current Labour government getting it right on immigration, both as a matter of ethics and as a matter of political strategy. Tom has argued that it is. I have argued that it is not. The context of this is I've talked about on the podcast and I've written about in various publications for some time now, a worldview I call reactionary centrism. In a nutshell, this is the idea that a rising far-right, Trump, the threat of reform here in the UK and so on, can be understood as just that, a reaction, that social justice and wokeness and cultural liberalism went too far. We got too far ahead of public opinion and provoked a backlash, and that the way to respond is to make compromises, to make concessions. For parties like the Democrats or Labour here in the UK to give ground, particularly on cultural issues like immigration and trans rights, with the goal of regaining moderate voters that they've lost to the Republicans or Tories and Reform, respectively. I've been a critic of this on two fronts. One, I think that's just not a good model for what's going on. And two, I don't think it is working, has worked, or will work, and I think those two are connected. It doesn't work because it proceeds from a flawed understanding of the world. I didn't coin that term, I picked it up from others and just started using it as sort of a shorthand for a worldview that I think isn't serving us. My one contribution to the literature on this is I think I can claim to have imported this term reactionary centrist to the UK. I wrote a few months back an article called What is a Reactionary Centrist and Does the UK Have Them? And that's since been picked up by others. And I've argued that the UK really is the first really solid, almost like laboratory conditions test case for can reactionary centrism work as a philosophy of government. In the American case, it's one faction amongst many for the Democrats, whereas it really has, I think, now fully captured the Labour Party. And I've been a critic of this. Then, more recently, Tom Prosser, who is a professor of European political economy at Cardiff Business School, and someone I know a bit through the podcast, and also he has a pretty popular Substack where he writes on politics and culture, wrote an article defending Labour's overall approach to government, particularly its approach to the immigration issue, and pushing back both on some of the academic, but also some of the popular critiques of them, pushing back on studies that purport to show that trying to compete with the far right on immigration doesn't work, and articles like mine that make the case that this is a failed reactionary centrist project. People who follow us both requested a discussion stroke debate between us on this, and so we set that up. This is that. As always, if you enjoy my work, please do consider supporting on Patreon for any amount. Patreon.com/political philosophy podcast. Patreon.com/political philosophy podcast. I don't do any advertisements. All of my podcasting work is made possible by the voluntary support of listeners. And I guess I would add that in an age where I think a lot of the media coverage and analysis and commentary on a rising far right has not been good and not been useful, I hope humbly make the case that it's important to support media that you think is So, yeah, please do consider supporting. And if you're not able to support financially, sharing my episodes on social media is also really helpful. So, thank you to anyone who does either of those two things. All right, let's get straight to it. This is me and Tom debating the UK Labour Party. I am joined today by Tom Prosser. Tom, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
And returning guest, you were on, I want to say like 3 or 4 years ago.
I think it was autumn 2021.
I'll trust your memory to it.
Ah,
Um, so I've sort of wanted to have someone on who'll. I invited a guest in one of my past interviews to say some nice things about Keir Starmer, and neither of us found too many. So I, as you know, have written a few articles critical of the current government, and you just had, it was just on your Substack, right? A
yeah.
piece about why you think Labour's getting it right. So I thought that was interesting. I'm sure we'll disagree about the specifics of that, but I want to
Yeah.
start by just asking you to make the positive case in your own words for as long as you want, really. Your piece was titled Why Labour's Getting It Right on Immigration. Why is Labour getting it right on immigration?
Well, I think it in a nutshell, as you said, yes, I do think Labour's getting it right on immigration. It's really a complicated question. I tried to get some of those complexities over in my Substack post. Before I start, I do want to say that I think it's important to consider ethical and electoral rationales quite differently. I think we'd agree on that. Where
Agreed.
just
Yeah,
if something is because I get the sense that lots of people in Labour, well, maybe not a lot, but certainly people in Labour don't. They just think that whatever makes most electoral sense, will do it. And I certainly agree that's not the way to run a country. And as I'll argue later, I'm not sure that's necessarily separating ethical and electoral rationales. I'm not sure that leads one necessarily into a more pro-immigration position, but we'll get into that. And I think also why this debate is so interesting because it involves philosophical interpretations of data, which I'm sure will also be up the street of your listeners. Since the replication crisis, social scientists have been far less confident in findings rooted in quantitative data. It's just not the case anymore, and it never was really that one can just look at numbers and say, "Aha, this shows that." That this is the case and policymakers should do X, Y, and Z. It's just not the case. And that's extremely interesting, I think. And in the case of the data here, I think there are a number of things to say about it that'll lead me to my main points. First of all, what does convince me, and I don't think people could reasonably dispute it, is the finding that most Labour is mainly bleeding votes to the left. It had this quite diverse coalition in 2024, and what the British election study data show very conclusively, Jane Green and Martin Maori have written about this, is that they're keeping together about 50% of their 2024 voting coalition, which is really quite low. There are lots of don't knows, but for the remainder, they are losing about twice as many to the left-wing parties as they are to the right-wing parties. that can't reasonably be disputed, although the strategic implications can be. I think what's more interesting is you often hear the claim that that studies show that when mainstream parties adopt positions that accommodate niche parties or very often radical right parties, that it backfires. I was looking at the evidence on this for the topic of immigration because it is some people assert it, and I'm just not sure that it's quite as strong as assert. And this is where I think you get into philosophical debates about data that are very interesting. Because let's say if I were advising Keir Starmer, I'd certainly tell him that Labour is mainly bleeding votes to the left. But on the issue of whether accommodative policies are counterproductive, I'd be far more cautious. I would want to see 5 or 6 studies that came to unambiguous findings showing that Labour that accommodative policies that made concessions to the radical right were leading to electoral gains for the radical right. And I just don't think that that evidence is there. Lots of quite a few of the studies really contain quite a lot of null results and small effect sizes. There are certain studies that show the opposite. I'm just not, and you have to be far more careful with inferential statistics compared to descriptive statistics. The evidence I was discussing just a moment ago is descriptive statistics, and it's basically that's to say that I'm really not convinced about the second claim that these policies, that accommodative policies backfire. Um, and then so it leads to this electoral question. If Labour were adopting more liberal policy on immigration, that's the counterfactual here, would they be doing better electorally? Now you've got to say they're doing badly electorally at the moment, very badly. I think I saw them down to 15%, although there are debates over whether that polling company is good, but it was 17% with YouGov last week. Um, so they are doing badly. Would they be doing better if they adopted more liberal policies on immigration? I'm really not convinced they are. Why? Well, first of all, of the voters who are thinking of voting for the Greens and Liberal Democrats, they're not particularly pro-immigration anyway. They only register a mean of 5 on a 0 to 10 immigration scale. In terms of their attitudes, whether they're pro or anti, they're not particularly concerned about immigration. It's not a particularly important issue for them. Lots of the Labour don't knows are really quite skeptical about immigration. I mean, the people who voted for Labour in 2024 now don't know. They're only 3.5 on the scale. So that's pretty low. 0 is negative, 10 is positive towards immigration. And I just think that were Labour to adopt a pro-immigration position, they would put really wind in the sails of the right-wing parties, and they'd get savaged in the press. And the question isn't whether the press is in the moral right or not. It's just a question of what the press would do. The party has to play on the pitch on which it finds itself, and I think that they would be savaged in the press. They might flip a lot of don't knows into the right-wing camp. They might increase turnout on the right. I just think that given the headline findings here that if we talk in headline terms, immigration is not popular in the UK generally. The YouGov tracker really paints quite a negative picture. I think it's 70% of people, I could be wrong there, but it's a pretty high figure, say that immigration has been too high over the last 10 years. And I do know that there are specific findings. There's a very good British social attitudes report that points out caveats that must be made. When you ask about specific policies, voters are more pro-immigration. But the headlines here on the British election study and the YouGov tracker are that public opinion is generally against immigration. I really don't think that sort of leaning into that area against the wind of public opinion is going to be electorally successful. I'm just not convinced. It could be. I certainly could be wrong, but I just don't see it myself. And now we come to the ethical dimension of this debate. I do like your reactionary centrist article. I disagree with lots of it, obviously, but I do agree that discourse on the right has really become poisonous over the last year, and lots of the stuff you see on social media is dreadful. And I'm very keen to return to a position where that's not the case and discourse is more liberal. Yeah, I think I said in the piece that my wife is Polish, and we have half Polish children. We speak Polish in public with them, and I remember at the time of the referendum where there was a wave of anti-immigrant, anti-Polish incidents. And that's the last thing I want to return to. But I think that the best way to achieve that is through some sort of compromise. The, I don't think it's a good idea to focus on where public opinion might end up. I think we have to deal with public opinion as it is. To give an example from international relations, you really have to just accept that someone like Mr. Putin has got dreadful aims, and there are people who support him with dreadful values, and that's just something you have to accept. You have to recognize that there is a certain reality, and you have to accommodate to it. And I think that in the case of immigration, generally public opinion is against immigration, and also that there has been a steep rise in immigration. There was almost a million in 2023, really a very significant increase. And I don't, as I said, I'm not sure that the existing studies tell us all that much about causal influences here. I think you have to really judge things on a one-off basis, but I really do find it difficult to believe that the high rate of a negative attitude towards immigration don't follow from the high levels. And I think that the best way to meet the concerns would be to try and lower immigration to the levels that it would just a few years ago. That's yeah,
That's your overall case.
that's my overall case.
Okay, great. So you made a number of points, and let's start with some agreements. First, I agree that we can often run together the ethical and electoral concerns. They're not completely independent, but those are clearly, you know,
Hmm.
those are. Yeah, I think we agree. People can often talk as if they're the same thing. As if the most moral thing is the most electable. So we agree there. We also agree with being concerned with how radical the right in this country, certainly one could talk about America, and perhaps we might get to international comparisons,
Hmm.
is becoming. And I mean, but even in this country, you only need to look at some of the stuff like the Katie Lamb Phillips proposal that came out a month ago. It's really insane
Yes, of
stuff.
course. Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
Um, so here's what I propose. I have a number of counterpoints to a number of things you've said. Rather than sort of taking up 10 minutes, I think I'll sort of go through them one by one and then get your response on each. And
Yeah. Sounds good. Yeah.
I guess my first question to you, though, and it's a blunt one, is it would be this doesn't appear to be working, does it? Like, you can say, and I think the position in the inner circles of the Labour Party for people like Morgan McSweeney seems to be, yes, things aren't looking very great, but they'd be somehow even worse if we'd governed in a more centre left manner. That seems to me a bit like you can say, oh, midterm polling slumps are normal, but not like this. The closest analog I can think to this is something like that weird bit in 2019 where both Labour and the Tories collapsed. But even that, they didn't get as bad as this, and even that, they rebounded pretty quickly. I think the polling average for Labour right now is 17%. And in real world election results, I mean, you're in Wales, we saw Plaid Cymru and Reform both just leapfrog the main parties. I think we could see stuff like that across the country. And this is something that people on my side of this debate, which is to say those of us that would critique a view we call reactionary centrist, which is a pejorative, no one self-identifies as that, but I would say is the sort of animating principle of Labour that in a nutshell, we're living in a world of a rising far right. And the best way to sort of take the air out of that is to throw them a bone, to like meet them in the middle on particularly hot button cultural issues. We're talking today about immigration. You could also talk about, trans rights in you know, in that setting. And I think one of the things we sort of feel on our side is we keep telling you this isn't going to work. Like I said when Starmer did his November speech last year, where he basically accepted the premise that the main problem with the country is too many immigrants coming in, and the main responsibility of his government was to lower that number. I said at the time, this isn't going to work. This is going to destroy his own. This is going to cede ground to the right and destroy his own coalition. And then when he did the Island of Strangers speech, I wrote an open letter with Olasya Nuti from York, in which 225 political scientists and theorists in this country signed their names to a letter to the government saying this isn't going to work. And since then, they've gone from level pegging with reform to 12 points behind. And it's not just polling averages. The far right are emboldened across society, as you saw with the Tommy Robinson March, which is exactly what my theory of the world would say would happen. And you could look to the States, you could go back as far as Obama. There was this pattern of preemptively making concessions to a radicalizing right. And we said at the time, this won't work. And I think from our perspective, one of the things that strikes us as so off about reactionary centrism, and again, that's a pejorative term. You can debate whether you think it's a good characterization, certainly. But one of the things from optics is it just seems unfalsifiable. Like the theory seems to be you need to make concessions to the right, and if that doesn't work, you need to make more. There's no point at which you would look at the evidence and reevaluate. If the left lose an election, we have to make concessions to be more electable next time. But if we win, as Labour did, we also have to make concessions to govern, even if, as in Labour's case, that takes them well to the right of their manifesto commitments. And, I want to get to some of your more specific points, but I did want to start with that question. Like, what would falsification look like? And if this isn't it, what is?
I don't, just a quick note on falsification. I wouldn't I'm not sure it applies to a case as broad as this, where there are so many variables. But yes, you make an excellent point. Of course, Labour is doing very badly in the polls. I think, though, that primarily,
Falsifications may be an overly formal term. What would this not working look like?
yeah, yeah, of
What would a
course,
moment
yeah,
where we have to take a
sure.
step back and go, okay, we need to rethink look like?
Yeah, and
Sorry, go
no,
ahead.
I certainly I buy. I can't talk, of course, with people like Morgan McSweeney, but certainly didn't like the Island of Strangers speech. I agree that discourse is very important, and I think that a very good case could be made that Starmer went too far, as he acknowledged, but because as we've seen. Labour really aren't competing by and large for the same voters as Reform. But what I would defend, and I really do agree with Labour, is a more recent approach of Starmer, where the attack is brought to Reform, where more specific things are denounced, but at the same time, he's clear. He reorganizes the cabinet to get Shabana Mahmood as Home Secretary. That the issue will be addressed. I think really that if Labour were to adopt a more liberal position on immigration, there would still be objections on things like the economy. From left-wingers, British election study data show that that's the most important issue for the people who are leaving Labour. You have issues like Palestine. It's normal for Labour governments to bleed votes to the left, not at this rate, admittedly. But I think there are certainly wider issues in British politics where partisan identification is very low, or and it's really destabilizing the whole system. The Conservatives have problems with this, which is to say that I think Britain is very difficult to govern. Now, of course, Labour are doing appallingly in the polls, but I'm just not convinced that they would be doing better. Um, if they adopted a more liberal approach. And also I think here it's interesting, but because you come back to the division between electoral and ethical rationales. And as I said in my article, I just don't think it would be good for the country for a more liberal position to be taken, but because it really then Labour would it might maybe it might be in the electoral interest of the Labour Party to form this left-wing coalition, as seems to be the case in the United States and in um, other European countries. But I think that it would really lead to a much more polarized Great Britain, where the right would really be on the front foot. Yeah, and I don't yeah, I think it is very interesting, but because as I've said, I'm not sure of the potential of existing studies to really set out a clear roadmap. It is one of those things where you have to judge it on a case by case basis. But given the state of opinion on immigration, it just seems to me as if it wouldn't be good for the country, and I'm really not sure good for the Labour Party electorally either, to sort of lean into this issue in which people have quite a clear opinion generally.
Okay, so let me just take one point, which is the public opinion is generally anti-immigrant. So this tends to be the starting point from which reactionary centrism reasons, and they say, well, look, you've got 54% or whatever it is favouring very hardline anti-immigrant policies. Like, in order to win, you surely have to give ground to that. And there's a certain logic there, right? You target the median voter, you build the biggest coalition. I think that the obvious question to it is, so why does it keep persistently failing? Why are the Democrats in the States doing a lot? Well, not to say they're doing brilliantly, but they're doing better than Labour is. They just had a string of quite big victories just a few days ago. Why have they held their voting coalition together and Labour hasn't? The other sort of point I'd challenge is, that I think you said at one point that we have to just take public opinion as fixed. And I would say why the right doesn't respond that way when the right really, transgender issues, to take another case, was not even remotely a voting concern for anything other than a tiny minority of people until the right decided they were going to make it one. Um, One bit of polling I find quite interesting is there's definitely, I would say, about half the country are very, very anti-immigrant right now. So I think it was 45% would support an end to all new immigration, right? You can argue about the poll or whatever, but it's something like that number, right? Which is a very radical position. But interestingly, that number falls to 22% if they're told that stopping all immigration would harm the economy. And it drops to 15% if you say, would you support stopping all immigration if it would lead to NHS staffing shortages? Now, stopping all immigration would almost certainly lead to NHS staffing shortages. But people aren't factoring that into their thinking because, by and large, they've only heard from one side. To live in this country for the past, I would say, 20 years now, certainly 15, is to be under a Niagara of hostile and often just straight factually false reporting about immigration. Like the average Brit believes that most immigrants are here illegally, which is a preposterously false statement. And where have they got that from?
Mhm.
They've got it because they've heard a narrative again and again and again that people are coming here in waves illegally to take your jobs and your benefits. And that just isn't the reality of what immigration looks like in this country. And people are so anti-immigrant. Now, I agree, we can't just wave a magic wand and make the right-wing press go away. But if people on the other side at least attempted to persuade, I'm convinced, like I say, there's that chunk of 30% of the country who want all immigrants out, but would prioritise the NHS over that. Can we not attempt even to make an argument to those people? Especially given, and I really want to stress this, our argument is factually correct. Stopping all inward immigration and deporting 4 million people who are already here would destroy the NHS.
Yeah.
Hospitals would close. Like, can we, given that our argument is true, can we not? Yes, I agree, we're not going to be able to. We have free speech, we can't just shut the other side up. But can we not at least attempt to put a case to the country?
Well, I'm not sure it's quite as easy as saying it's true or false. Certainly on the NHS, yes, that's broadly true. But of course, as you know, the waters get a bit muddier as you go to different issues. But yeah, on public opinion, that is a very important point because the situation is complex. You've probably seen, or I'm sure you've heard, some of the statistics from the British Social Attitudes survey. I think Robert Ford was involved with that, and he cites some of the statistics on Blue Sky quite often, and indeed, lots of them are quite liberal because once you get into, or give hope to liberals, because once you get into the nitty-gritty and you tell people about some of the consequences of anti-immigrant policies or hardline anti-immigrant policies or whatever, they become more liberal. But this is where when you get into more fine-grained polling, what scholars tend to do and scholars of public opinion tend to do is pay attention to the headline findings. And if you look at the main measures which are used in YouGov's tracker, the long-standing tracker, those results, the general results, are really pretty unambiguous. And with the British election study as well, the only item on the immigration self item on the British election study, which is the main one, again, it's quite unambiguous. Now, I'm not saying that the more specific questions don't matter, but I'm saying that I think it's a better idea to pay more attention to the more established, more general questions that you govern the British election study privilege. On interesting comments about the media, because as I wrote in the article, we do have different views on that. As a background observation, I would say that I personally I do have different view of the origins of anti-immigration sentiment to some people, because I would regard it as partly anthropological. Yeah, personally, I'm an economic left winger, and on the social dimension of politics, I'm something of a conservative, and I think that reflects the fact that I regard humans generally as not liking change, as being somewhat suspicious of external influences or outsiders. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that I condone things that might take place in the state of nature, or things that are in inverted commas natural, but it certainly does mean that I'm more careful, I think, with my reading of how humans will react to change, like immigration, like neoliberal economic reforms, and so I, to an extent that liberals wouldn't, I guess I do see humans as having a sort of a natural tendency to be concerned about outside influences, and that leads us onto the press, but because of course the press has an important influence on the immigration debate. There are a lot of studies that show that the framing influence of the press is important. Lots of them have been conducted just a few hundred yards from where I am now in the Cardiff School of Journalism. But at the same time, it's also undeniable that the press is picking up public opinion, and of course the public has a right to know about immigration rates, and I think quite independently of the influence of the press. As I was saying, the public is generally quite unlikely to react favorably to an immigration rate that is many times higher than it was in previous years. But yeah, of course, the press has an autonomous influence, but I just don't think I'd see it. I would emphasize the role of the press as extensively as you have.
I mean, the role of the press is real, and I think it is a question for liberal democracy of how we live with very loud voices within it, trying to destroy it. On the press specifically, I would make the point that with immigration particularly, I think also trans rights are another good example of this. People are responding. There's good data to back this up. People are responding to the level of press coverage, not absolute numbers. Like the extent to which people say, I am very concerned about immigration, and that's my number one issue, that directly tracks with tabloid coverage of it. Or to give an international example, there was something in the States that showed in the lead up to the most recent American election, Fox News coverage of immigration had massively skyrocketed. Now, there was no change in immigration numbers during that time, but as a result of that coverage skyrocketing, the number of Republicans who watched Fox News, who said it was their number one issue, went from something like 20% to something like 70%. It was absolutely stark. And people don't know. People aren't going on the government website and looking at numbers independently. They're, responding to what they see on their social media feeds, and their social media feeds are increasingly overtly fascistic. Um, let me actually move on to that point, because let me say a few words about. I've sort of made this point of like, well, it hasn't worked, has it? This never works. And let me sort of say why I think that is, because it's very easy to point fingers from the sidelines and say, well, it didn't work.
Mm.
But I guess the response could be, well, anything else would have done even worse. I think it doesn't work because the theory that animates reactionary centrism has not taken the measure of what it is we are up against. We are up against a global fascist resurgence that cannot be appeased, that cannot be compromised with, that seeks a total new social order and the end of liberal democracy. And I think what people hear when we say that is I'm a child who's being difficult for the sake of it, or I'm against compromise on principle. And that really isn't what we're saying. We're saying in some circumstances, compromise isn't possible. And, you know, fascism is a strong word. I'm increasingly comfortable using it and would defend it. I think the academic consensus on what we would call the Trump movement has now settled on that fascist is an accurate term. I think Kevin Elliott's work on this is pretty persuasive. And even, the people who sort of really resisted using the fascism word, like I know Corey Robin, Samuel Moyn, have since backed off it and said, yeah, I was wrong here. Um, and that's the States, but it is coming here. You can look at Elon Musk's funding of appearance in Tommy Robinson's rallies, boosting on X. And Musk, to my mind, of all the figures in the new right, is your absolute clearest cut case for a fascist. If you take a Michael Frieden approach of like defining an ideology by its core concepts, what would we say fascism is? Its core concept, something like, the state, the nation understood in racial and cultural terms, masculinity, violence, the restoration of a mythic past, something like that as the core concepts. They're all there in how Musk communicates. Like, he had this post recently, I've just written an article on it, in fact, where he said people in the UK, they're like hobbits in the Shire, and they don't know of all these murderous orcs who are going to come there. And I'll just quote him directly: 1,000 people will show up in your town of 500 and start raping your children.
Mm.
Direct quote. Okay, so and then he said, in order to survive, you must give power to hard men like Tony Robinson. Violence is coming to you and it must be met with violence. Okay, this is an overtly fascist narrative, right?
Mm.
That isn't a disguised or dressed up. That is the real thing.
No,
And
agreed.
and it's working. Like, this is impacting our society. I mean, reform leading the polls. I mentioned lambs, what can really only be described as an ethnic cleansing policy. And it's not just capital P politics. Schools have reported a massive surge in racist bullying. Nurses have reported a 55% increase in racist incidents against them. Immigration judges and lawyers are getting death threats. It's running through our entire society. And I go through all of that because I think this really is sort of the central question of our age. Do you think this is real fascism and it's real? And I think a lot of our other debates and disagreements are downstream of that. And, if what I'm saying is right, the key question is, will feeding the wolf starve or strengthen it? Will making concessions to fascism pacify or embolden it? And to conservatives of 30 years ago in the 90s, making some concessions around cultural issues, you can point to a track record on there. Blair being tough on crime, something like that, right? Today, I just don't think you can. I think we see again and again that concessions embolden them.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Let me just start first of all with the comments about the media you made at the start. I think identifying a causal relationship between between the media and public opinion, media coverage and public opinion is very difficult. You know, for example, also in around 2020, media coverage of things like white privilege and intersectionality, words like that associated with the left, also went up. And I think it's difficult to argue that yeah, such trends were merely a media invention. They were reflecting the developments in public opinion and also you mentioned the transgender issue. I think that just as rises in immigration in 2000 in the early 2000s were important in this case, I think on the transgender issue, you've got to acknowledge that the whole terms of the campaign changed. In Britain, Stonewall starts campaigning for self-identification in 2016. So you can see there I'd push back on the question of of the press having this very significant influence. Um, on the broader comments about the current historical moment we're in and the the rise of fascism or radical right populism or whatever. Of course, yeah, the trends in the US are extremely concerning. The well-respected Varada's Democracy Index, I was quite shocked to hear that it's going to significantly downgrade the US democracy quite imminently, which it didn't really do in the first Trump term. So it's a massive and real problem. And I think where the reactionary centrist argument is very strong is you're right in that people should fight Trump unambiguously on democracy, but because it's a full frontal attack, and the left should join forces. You know, there's not much black and white there. But to cite the title of a famous book, "We Are Not America." The UK is an entirely different context, and our democratic institutions aren't being attacked. You know, there's going to be no downgrade of VDEM. VDEM are not going to downgrade the UK imminently. I don't see the same thing happening at all. And I just think that you're really overemphasizing the comparisons with America. There is a specific challenge in the UK where there's no general attack on liberal democracy, but there is this issue with immigration, where it's very unpopular, and I think that is related to the rise of the far right, and I think in this specific instance, Labour really has to. It would be best for the country, not necessarily the Labour Party electorate, but best for the country if it became less salient. I know that the strategic aim of the Labour Party is to make immigration not an issue by 2029. I'm not sure if they're going to be able to achieve that, but I am quite confident in saying that if immigration becomes less salient, it will be in the interests of the United Kingdom as a country.
Okay, let me do 2 points. Let me do trans in the media and then overemphasizing US UK comparisons. I mean, I think the trans debate in the UK is one of your clearest cut cases that this is about a top-down media campaign. So, UK's had legal gender transition since 2004. This was not an aspect of our politics really at all until quite recently. Indeed, in 2017, all of the major political parties, including the then governing Conservatives, ran
Mm.
on reforming the GRA to make gender transition easier. That was part of May's manifesto. It was actually part of the Labour manifesto until the last election. What changed? In 2012, there were 60 articles in the UK press published about transgender people, transgender rights, anything within that. Over the next decade, that would increase by several orders of magnitude. In 2022, there would be 7,500 articles about trans people printed in the UK press. Um, Most of them overwhelmingly negative, with these kind of fascist adjacent themes about like the security of women and girls and so on and so forth. And then, you know, going from the press not covering it all to them covering it relentlessly and relentlessly negatively, yeah, guess what? Public opinion on it shifted. We went from majority support for people being able to transition and sort of live their lives to a much more muddied plurality support. And it depends. You can get on the specific issues of like bathroom access, sports, whatever. They swing quite wildly, but definitely the public opinion has shifted as a result of that. But more than public opinion, political opinion has shifted. Labour in 2016 um, absolutely denounced bathroom bans that were being implemented in American states like North Carolina, and its leading politicians called them inhuman and said they would never happen here, right? They are now implementing a bathroom ban that is considerably more extreme um, than ones that Republican governors in the states have vetoed. So I think the trans issue, the trans rights one is absolutely as clear a cut case as you're going to get of this is about the media driving an issue. And I think what the trans one really shows is if your starting point is to find a policy concession with the right, how far and how fast you can be pulled. Labour is now their position is not just well to the right of their 2024 manifesto position, it's well to the right of Theresa May, and it's well to the right of Republican governors. So I think that one just really directly speaks to my narrative. Now, with regards to am I overemphasizing similarities, um, I'm pointing out direct lines of influence. I go back to Elon Musk is a prominent, he had a bit of a spat with Trump, but he is a prominent figure in the American right. He's a very powerful man, both because of his money, but also he owns the website where most journalists get their information from. That's a huge source of power. He is, I would say, as he is, I think that's your clearest cut case for an overt fascist. And he's directly trying to influence British democracy. Now, the main issue he's driving at us with is immigration. And what I would say is, you think if the Labour government makes the visa things a bit more restrictive, or like, um, that is going to shut someone up like Elon Musk, whose primary metaphor for immigrants is that they're inhuman monsters who are raping our kids. And that's just like literally what he says. Do you think that there is any factual basis to his views at all? All you can do is name and oppose. And that is something this government has just refused to do. This is what I want from them. We can debate about should there be an income requirement for a spousal visa? I don't think there should, but fine, right? But why are they still on Musk's website when his stated position is that Keir Starmer should be hung? Why are they still on his website? Why have they not opposed this more overtly? Why are they not calling it what it is? And to say that the UK isn't at risk of democratic collapse, what do you think men like Musk want for us? When they say we must surrender control of our country to men of violence, what do you think they have in mind? Because it's not liberal democracy.
Yeah, coming going back to the transgender issue, I think we do have very different perspectives on this, and we're not going to agree. But yeah, I would emphasise, as you know, the way the terms of the debate changed, with, for example, Stonewall's advocation of self-identification from 2016, and I'd emphasise that let's say that that's a Butlerian, if I can use that word, advocacy of transgender rights compared to a sort of a million J.S. Mill advocacy of transgender rights that had taken place before that. And I think if you look at, if you like, the million aspects of transgender rights, they still poll quite well in the United Kingdom. Whereas if you look at the Butlerian aspects of the of this issue, where it's about self-identification, they're not polling so well. And we have different opinions, sure, but I'd say that this very different reading of the issue appears from 2016. It wasn't really put on the agenda by the press. It came from different activist groups and whatever. I obviously don't quite buy that the press created it, and I really think to come back to the point, if you're going to emphasize the role of the press so heavily, you have to account for the very significant increase press coverage of white privilege or intersectionality, which again is a subject of academic record. Where's that coming from? I think, as with immigration or transgender rights, I'd say that it's a mix of things. That these are things that have come on to the public radar and become more salient in society. To a great extent, the press is reacting to them. On the second point, on the role of Elon Musk, yes, I entirely agree. It's poisonous. But again, I don't. And yeah, he's the world's richest man, and of course he controls Twitter, which is a major communications platform. But I think that I would emphasize a limit to his influence. I don't think he's capable of controlling and reshaping democracy. I don't think he has that significant influence on UK public opinion. But yeah, of course, I agree that his rhetoric, yes, is fascist, and it's extremely regrettable the extent of the influence he has.
I mean, it's not just Musk, though. Like, you know, the Tory party, well, it's not clear because Badnoch's both said that it is their policy and it isn't. It is the policy of at least some within the Tory party to deport at a minimum 3.5 million legal residents.
Mm.
Like that's a worrying sign. I think, obviously the UK is not the US, but I think some of those analogies, some of the ways in which it is not should not be reassuring to us. Our politicians and our press have been much less willing. I did a bit of like a sort of quasi-empirical study on
Mm.
this recently, much less willing to name and oppose fascism. Like Democrats will generally call Trump a fascist. Like even
Yeah.
mainline ones, like Kamala Harris did. Joe Biden ran in 2020 saying, I don't think he used fascist, I think he said white supremacist, but ballpark. This is a battle for the soul of America. Like that's what people like me are calling for and what we let me make this point because this is what people like me are calling for and what we want to see is I think to the sort of reactionary centrist view it's all about policy and like I agree if Labour like let us just say there was an alternate universe in which they hadn't made the spousal visa route harder, what difference does that make? Probably none, right? Um, I think it's about drawing a values contrast. Politics, big picture, is about values and policies. It's about both, right? It's, to be simple, what are you doing and why are you doing it?
Mm.
Right. And I think the reactionary centrist worldview, and I apologize for using a pejorative term, it's just
That's
the one I
fine.
have in my head, um, is just so focused on the policy proposition that they kind of miss the values proposition. And I think you can only compromise so far before you muddy or contradict your values. Before you're either implicitly or explicitly saying Nigel Farage is basically right. You know, um, Policy communicates values. It's not just, I certainly critiqued Starmer's speech in November, where he essentially conceded the point that the main problem facing the country is immigration. Like,
Yeah.
why? You don't need to concede that framing. But also the policies they've implemented. If you are going to say, put good character tests in the immigration system or make language requirements more stringent, what you're communicating is that you believe immigrants are troublemakers, you believe that a homogeneous society is a better one, and you end up with this muddy values proposition where the Labour Party is simultaneously saying it both believes and doesn't believe in pluralism. It both believes and doesn't believe in core liberal rights. It both believes and doesn't believe in an open society. And that's what voters find repellent. Like, if you ask people, not like from a set list, just give me a few words of what you think Keir Starmer stands for. The most common single word people use is nothing. People like people who have values. Voters judge politicians through values. They judge them not just, oh, I'm going to do X, Y, Z, but the overarching narrative that X, Y, Z are embedded within. And so, to the point about like, oh, am I saying Labour would win if they were just more liberal? That's not quite what I'm saying. I'm saying that you need to have a strong value set of your own to contrast with the far right. Now, that value set of your own needn't be hyper left wing. I think when I say you need to have a values forward politics, what people hear me as saying is I want every politician to be maximally performatively woke. I want them to start every speech with a land acknowledgement and pronouns, and like that's not what I'm saying at all. Like that can correlate with centrism. Centrists, I think, are more appeaserish, but there's plenty who aren't. So in the States, you've got someone like Bill Kristol, who used to be a Republican. I write for his magazine with no
Mm.
compulsion at all because he's a very strong anti-fascist. Now, I'm sure we disagree about all sorts of stuff, but we both think Trump is a fascist and must be resisted at all costs, and we both see ourselves as part of a coalition on that basis. You know, you can oppose fascist values with certainly with woke values. You could oppose them. You could oppose them with socialist values, but you could also oppose them with classically liberal values or sort of mainline liberal values. Heck, you could even oppose them with a sort of small c conservative respect for institutions type values. But you've
Mm.
got to oppose them. You've got to have a story of your own. And, like a lot of what I'm asking for in the UK isn't your most woke college kid, or certainly not to have Jeremy Corbyn back. What I'm asking for is Joe Biden. I'm asking for someone who says we are in a battle for the soul of the country against foreign fascist freaks like Elon Musk, and we must win it. Like that was the message Joe Biden ran on in 2020, and incidentally, that was the only time the Democrats beat Trump, was when they drew the most overt values contrast. And on the immigration debate, that's not to say we need to go to an open borders position. My own views on immigration are like, I'm fine with it, but like, you can decisively reject the fascist narrative that non-white men are dangerous to white women, and you can go hard at them for saying such a disgusting thing, which Starmer hasn't. He said, when he asked about that specific narrative, he said, and I quote, I get it. Right?
Yeah.
Um, you can say, as I don't think left radical John Swinney said, We're a country that welcomes refugees, that believes that certainly sectors like our National Health Service are stronger for immigrants. And then you can also say, sure, the current asylum backlog of cases isn't optimal. Like, it's not a safety risk to have so-called asylum hotels in your town, but I agree it's inefficient and not the right solution. We can certainly clean up details. It doesn't have to be maximalistly progressive on every front. But I think you have to start with that values contrast. And I think 30 years ago, you could get away with being a politician who didn't really believe in anything. And indeed, you could almost advertise that as a fact about yourself. I don't think we're in that world anymore. I think they need a narrative, they need a story, and they need values.
Yeah, of course, and that's why I liked Keir Starmer's approach at the Labour conference, where he was far more confident. You could see what he believed, that he believed what he was saying from to a far greater extent. As you said, a problem with Starmer is that he just straddles these various positions, and you never really know what he believes. But at the conference, he denounced reform, which of course is very important. But at the same time, he was unambiguous in saying that he'd address legitimate concerns of voters. And I think on coming to the Tories point, I completely agree that rhetoric like Katie Lamb's is really extremely worrying, and it should be countered. But at the same time, do I think the Conservative Party are the exact equivalent of the Republican Party in the US? No, I don't think that at all. We had 14 years of conservative government. It's a much more centrist party than the Republican Party. Now, of course, the issue isn't really the Conservative Party in Britain, I guess. It's reform. But I'm really not sure that just trying and moving actively towards this American style split of the left v the right is going to be in the national interest, or indeed most effective in beating reform. I think that probably we both agree that starving reform of the oxygen of the immigration debate is the most effective way of doing this, of returning British politics to a more to a calmer and more traditional state. But as we've obviously established, we have different ways of doing that. I think that meeting some of the concerns, and these aren't merely things, as I've emphasized, these aren't merely things that Reform has put on the table. British public opinion to immigration, even among people who've never voted Reform, is really quite skeptical. Even if there are caveats one must make. So yeah, I think that's a crux of our disagreement.
I think when I do transatlantic comparisons, the sort of response is okay, but Britain isn't the US. And like, I sort of feel like going, well, yes, obviously, but I think the point isn't that they're exactly the same. I think that it's that modern fascism's aspirations are overtly and self-consciously international, right? Like they see a white world remade in their image, and a lot of the real core fascists in America are very concerned about Europe, and they buy into, I guess, what you'd call like great replacement theory, that sort of white people are being replaced. And it is something that they're self-consciously trying to influence us with. And I guess my American experience is that I would say I've heard all this before. Like when Donald Trump first ran in 2015, 2016, the overwhelming sense was, look, Republicans are a conservative party, but they're not nuts. The party will come to this man will. There was no sense that Trump could win the nomination, much less the election. And there were a handful of us, like me, who were saying, you do not understand how radicalized the Republican activist base has become. These are not people who are merely very conservative. These are people who believe that the Democrats are literally demonic, right? These are people who now very, very overtly believe in a sort of return to the Jim Crow era or a sort of white Christian nationalism. Trump is where the primary electorate is at. Maybe not all of them, but enough of them. And that view was very, very fiercely fought until it was proved wrong. Like yes, this is where the Republican Party is at. And it's been now 10 years of us, what I call alarmists in the States, saying, you do realize this is what's coming next. Not because we have some psychic power, but because we're listening to what the fascists are telling us they plan to do. And like, so one big one I was saying for years and years and years, you realize Roe v. Wade is going to end. We're going to have the end of abortion rights in America. And the overwhelming consensus was this kind of, you're overreacting. Of course it won't. Don't you know there's all these constitutional principles and there's all these. And my point was, you do realize fascists don't care about constitutional principles and precedent. There was a big thing of like, oh yeah, Trump's making a fuss about the election, but he won't use violence to try and hang on to power. And people like me were saying, but he will. He's telling us he will. And obviously it's not one for one in the UK, but I would say all these people who write for the Daily Express or the Telegraph, or who are like staffers in the Conservative Party, they're all rotting their brains in the same fascist echo chamber, owned by a literal Nazi saluting fascist. They're all radicalizing in the same way. And like when what's his face made that joke about deporting Zana Sultana, I was like, oh, I know what this is. Like, this is exactly the same thing. Like, threatening to deport non-white progressive politicians is an absolute staple of American fascism. Trump does it all the time. He did it to Ilhan Omar. He's doing it now with Mamdani. And so when they started, I was like, oh yeah. And it's not because the Tory party is the same thing as the Republican Party. It's because the people in it are absorbing all of this online far right stuff, and they're reacting that way. And it wasn't an accident that that exchange happened on Twitter. So like, I would just say we're gonna now have 10 years in the UK, and I'm gonna be saying the whole time, you realise this is what's coming next, and there will be throughout those 10 years, the overwhelming media position will be that people like me are being hysterical, and we will keep being right again and again, and it won't shake them. I know this is coming now, and it's such a weird position to be in. As I've done this once, I was in the States through the whole Trump era. Every single time, the people who said, but this is a sensible party, yeah, it won't do this. Whenever they said they won't do this, they were making a list of the things the Republicans would do. And it's the same force, it's the same influence, it's the same radicalization process.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to emphasize the resilience in the American system. For example, VDEM, the Global Democracy Index, didn't change its rating of the US between 2016 and 2020. Now, of course, some dreadful things happened. I totally agree on Roe v. Wade, and yeah, the 2021, the January 6th attack, it was dreadful. And I do agree that probably someone like me would have said you were being alarmist. So you were vindicated,
But this is where people like me go a bit insane. Is there not? You've said people like me would say you're being alarmist.
Yeah, but that's only on one issue. If you look at this big, the VDEM index, which is the premier index of liberal democracy, the score didn't change. So we could say we were being alarmist.
I would say now, I don't know particular things. I would say now the US has transitioned from not to full fascism, not to full totalitarianism, but from liberal democracy to competitive authoritarianism.
It is now, yes, I agree. The second and the different kettle of
Now,
fish, but
now that
yeah.
took time, certainly, but that was clearly the intention of the Trump people from the beginning. And yeah, it took them 8 years, but that's nothing really to take down a long-standing constitutional republic. And that analogy should concern us because the UK does not have the same sorts of constitutional checks and balances that the US does. Democrats had more levers to pull to slow the ascent.
Yeah, that's true. But at the same time, there are lots of movements with bad intentions towards democracy, and often the issue is not their intention, but the extent of the damage they can achieve. And as I've said, I'm really not sure they're quite as strong in the UK. And also, you know, this talking about a fascist international, of course, evokes the communist international. And there were lots of there were communists at various points in the 20th century who had a very strong base and were on the march. And of course, there were conservatives who were urging the formation of an anti-communist sort of front in Western countries. And I'm really, as you can imagine, not sure that was a good idea, and equally, I'm not sure it's a good idea now. But because this polarization just tends to inflame contexts.
I think is polarization good? Manifestly not. You can point to it correlating with all sorts of negative social outputs. I think it is upon us whether we would want it or not. I think the question is not. The question is not can we make this go away? It's can we win? I would point out that the fascists have achieved quite a lot more and control several powerful states in a way that the communists never did, at least in America or anything like that. I mean, we're responding to something real. I think that's the core cleavage here is like, do you think the global fascist resurgence is real or not? And I want to really hammer you on something, which is you conceded, and I appreciate that you did concede it because some people won't even do that. That people, I'll just quote you, people like me would have said you're being alarmist because it's not just Roe, there's a dozen benchmarks of American liberal rights and democratic sort of structures. There's at least a dozen big benchmarks of those failing. And at every one of those benchmarks, people like me were saying that this is going to fail in advance. And at no point did the people saying you're being alarmist ever really pause to say, they admitted sometimes they got it wrong, but at no point did they pause to say, there's something about my model of the world and how I'm thinking about things that is causing me to get it wrong, right? Is it not and I started with the question of like Labour of like this didn't work, did it? Like I want to push you on this a bit. Is there not a point where like we've seen how things have gone over the last decade of where the people who say you're being alarmist like need to take a deep breath and go, there's something about how I'm thinking about this that isn't right.
Yeah, as I said, look, I concede on that certain point on Roe v. Wade or the Capitol attack. I probably would have called you an alarmist, and you would have been right. But that doesn't mean I'm saying you're entirely right. But because equally, I can point to VDEM, which is the premier index of liberal democracy, and say it didn't change between 2016 to 20. I'm sure you'll concede that if you had made a prediction in 2016 that you would have conceded it would go downward quite significantly.
No, I mean, actually, the prediction of a lot of
Sorry, let me just clarify. I think it
yeah.
did go down a bit, but certainly nowhere near Hungarian or Polish levels.
But actually, the prediction of a lot of alarmists in the States was that this, meaning the sort of erosion of liberal democratic norms, would be a two-term project. That's what a lot of people said. Now, we didn't know in advance that those two terms would be non-consecutive, um, but there was generally going in a sense that what we would see was a sustained period of kind of reconnaissance in force. Like you find out what the barriers and boundaries are by attacking them. Um, and that was very much the sense after, certainly after January 6th, that what you saw failed. That was a coup attempt that failed, right? Um, but that they then would go back sort of knowing where the weak points were, which is what Project 2025 was. And what people like me said is you cannot take the fact that the first term, that the guardrails and the checks and balances largely, not totally, but largely held, you cannot take that as proof that they'll hold next time. Because what you saw through the whole first term was a sustained, like a velociraptor testing the fences, a sustained working out of what they needed to do. And people like me said it won't be another term of the same. What you will see is very fast. It will be like first year, right? And again, almost completely, and the overwhelming majority opinion was you're being alarmist. The guardrails held last time. That means they'll hold this time. And again, we were just right. I mean, I don't think anyone thought Trump will be a dictator on day one, but we thought he wanted to be. We thought the Republican Party would not meaningfully oppose him, and we thought the Republican base would continue to back him. And all of those were true. And yeah, I think a lot of us thought it would be a two-term thing. And we thought that in 2024, it would unravel very, very quickly if he got back in. I would say, yeah, no, we've just been right. And like, I understand that you sound like an asshole making that point of saying, look, we've just been correct. But like, I think at some point we have to say it because it's important that we learn from our mistakes.
As I said, I agree you were prescient in some ways, not all. And yeah, you've probably been particularly prescient in the last year. But we're talking about the UK, and of course, my point is that the UK is a very different system, and indeed, I think it's a very good argument to look at the US and say that you've got these two sides fighting each other, engaged in a war to the death, and you may make the point that it in the Labour, in the national interest for Labour to not get drawn into that. Now, of course, I don't entirely believe that Labour always acts in the national interest. Primarily, it's probably electorally self-interested, but at the same time, I do think that this centre path makes it less likely, not more likely, for as to avoid the trajectory of the US, which is very sad, and I do not want to see it in this country.
But we were right in the UK too. Like I said, as soon as Starmer started down this road, and again, I was not a critic of the Starmer government, at least not a big one, during the 2024 election campaign. I thought, you moderate a bit, you've got to put a bit of distance between yourself and Corbyn. Sure. It's when he started doing and saying stuff that I felt validated the far right's narrative. Then I was like, oh, this isn't good. One, I just disagree with it. But two, this isn't going to work. I've seen this before. It's not going to work. And again, I wrote a letter with Alessia Nuti that 225 academics in the UK signed. And one of the central points was this will not work. This will make reform rise in the polls and it will increase right radicalization across our society. And all of those things would have happened. I think if a year ago, when Labour was still a little bit ahead in the polls, if I'd have told you where we would be today, I think you'd have called me an alarmist. If I'd have told you the Tory party would publish an ethnic cleansing policy, I think you'd have called me an alarmist. Like,
Yes, I would have agreed, but I do think you're kind of engaging in cherry picking here because you may have been right on certain issues, but it doesn't mean if we were to. Obviously, I'm not sure of your wider record of predictions, but I'm sure that I could find others you'd made that just really haven't come off to the same extent.
I mean, on this, I invite challenge. Like, what have I got wrong?
I don't know. I'm obviously not familiar with your
Okay.
record.
Yeah, I mean that would be a sort of very central point I'd sort of push, and I guess I've belabored it, so I'll stop. But like, like maybe on other stuff, individual alarmists got it wrong, but I think on the sort of issue of is liberal democracy in danger, the sort of, and it's weird because there's sort of two sides of a coalition, right? We both agree we don't want reform in power, right? We both agree we don't want anything like what Katie Lamb is proposing to be
No, no.
implemented, right? We both agree Elon Musk is a fucking freak, right?
Yes,
Like,
yeah.
um, but like within that sort of anti-fascist coalition, we are really internally divided on sort of the is it fascism? And are we really in that much danger? And on that question, sort of isolated, which I think is really the core question of our age, I would say that alarmists and look, I get it to a degree, right? Like, I think the natural human tendency is to think things will go on the way they had before, right? The turkey gets fed a bit more every day leading up to Thanksgiving, and it thinks every day it'll get a bit more, not realizing the axe is coming. Um, but I think there has to be a point where it's like, it's not just that I, the anti-alarmist, happened to be wrong. There's something about how I'm thinking about the world that means I'm not picking up on stuff that keeps happening.
Yeah, I think in generally what I would say, and I've thought for some time, is that I'm really not sure that the far right is all that popular. Of course, you know, you rightly well I worry as well about its rise, but at the same time, Nigel Farage is an extremely unpopular politician in the United Kingdom. He's popular, very popular among certain people, and it's similar with Trump. And so therefore, I'm really not convinced yeah, that they've got enough sort of backing to go ahead with it. Now, of course, you know you could be right. You know, maybe I'm dismissing things yet again. I'm dismissing things as alarmist, and but I just don't see it. I think the basic difference we have is I don't see the UK as all that similar to the US.
Yeah, I think that that's a correct characterization of the difference. Yes. So you said it's not that popular. Yeah, yeah. And like my view is not that this is inevitable. Like if the fascist rise was inevitable, then you might as well just make your peace with it, right? And I think that is actually what some people think. I think this some people think this is the shape of things to come, and we might, which is I take what Katie Lamb is doing, right? Like we might as well just sort of throw in with that, which is I guess what a lot of people did with like the original Nazis, is it was like do I personally loathe Jewish people? But, this seems to be where things are going, and I'm going to go with it. I suspect a lot of people were like that. You know, Nigel, for the Reform Party's on what, like 30% of the vote, and most of the remaining 70% don't have a very positive view on them. Trump is a plurality, it's a strong plurality, but it's a plurality thing in the States. And, what's enabled him to do so much damage isn't that he represents some supermajority or like the authentic voice of the American Volk. Americans are almost down the middle divided on the man to do anything
Mm.
leaning against. Nonetheless, he has been able to do an incredible amount of damage with the acquiescence of one of their main political parties. And I would say maybe about 50 out of 350 million Americans really
Mm.
enthusiastically hardline backing him. But
Yeah,
his,
that's
his
true. Yeah.
hardcore support's probably only like 10-15% of the total
Yeah, which is true.
population.
Yeah, you could say, I guess, that with the 30s and 40s, it was similar. You
And,
know,
and
just because.
I would say that's the case with reform. They've got 30% of the country saying they'll vote for them, of which I would say, I'm just ballparking this, but let's say half of that, 15%, are genuinely bought into the far right project. To maybe put a figure to it, that's the 15% who say, I would want to deport all immigrants, even if it collapsed the NHS. Like, I would literally privilege my racism over not dying, right? Like, those people. But that
Mm.
can be enough if you get a major political party folding to you and an institutional structure that doesn't oppose you. Like, and I think yeah, no, this is absolutely a fight liberalism can still win. I mean, I'll agree that the last year has has not had some
Mm.
very spiriting results, but Liberals win all the time. There's been a few international elections recently where we beat the populist right. Like, I don't
Yeah.
think it's hopeless. I think there is a lot of damage a far right leader can do if they have a party fold to them and the activist base of the party really back them. It doesn't need 51%. You can do a lot of damage with 15. Um, and I would make that case, like the case in America that we made with Trump in 2015 and 16 was not that this is inevitable. It was not that this is everyone. It was kind of like three very simple points. Trump is genuinely a fascist and he believes this stuff. The Republican Party will not oppose him. And there's a minority who really will back it all the way. And that's all you need sometimes. And I would say all three of those conditions are met in the UK. Like Farage, I think is genuinely a nasty piece of work. I think obviously Reform won't oppose him. It looks increasingly like the Tories won't. And
Mhm.
there's enough of a radicalized group. And what you'll see is that isn't quite strong enough to succeed on its own. What it needs is institutional acquiescence. What it needs is people in the media and the main centre left parties who, instead of robustly opposing it, scold people like me and say, don't call it fascist. You can't call it fascist. That's not the right word. Or say, we've got to compromise with it. We've got to meet it halfway. Fascism is and always has been very opportunistic. You see it in how Trump campaigns. He'll throw 12 different things out and then pick the one that seems to get traction. You see it in how they did the coup attempt, where they just sort of attack everywhere to see where the weak points are. What you need is uniform and implacable opposition. So wherever they throw their punches, there's firm pushback to them. And that's why I find reactionary centrism so concerning is fascists need it. They need people to sanitize them. They need people to say, don't worry about it. They need people to make concessions because they're not strong enough on their own. But unless there's an absolutely united front of all of the rest of us saying absolutely not, they can and they will succeed.
Yeah, well, obviously we've established we disagree because I could say as well that the fascists want a united front against them, but because it's easier to polarize. Yeah, yeah,
Well, let's leave it there. That's our core
yeah,
disagreement.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Um, Tom,
Yeah.
thank you. That was spirited. That was fun. I appreciate your time.
No, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
I always give listeners a chance to plug. Any Blue Sky, but is your book out yet?
Yeah, it's coming out in February.
Okay, do you want to tell listeners about that?
I'd love to. Yeah, we're publishing a book called Beyond Woke and Anti-Woke, explaining the rise of social justice ideology, which basically examines changes in progressive ideologies over the last 10 to 15 years. And we do so by examining large data sets and looking at it in an analytic manner rather than engaging in the sort of silly cultural debates where we're trying to look at this analytically. And of course, Toby, you really helped during the writing process. So thank you very much.
Cool. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you very much.